One of the things that really resonates for me as an outsider about the Jewish tradition is that embedded within the celebration of every holy day seems to be a remembrance of an event or a period that helped form their identity as Jewish people. They became a unified people out of 12 tribes. Well, as unified as any group of people can be. Jewish holy days often focus on the narrative of wandering the desert for 40 years in search of the promised land, the land where they would be safe and free from enslavement. In the Torah, Sukkot is called by two different names in Hebrew. One translates to Festival of the Harvest, and the other to Festival of Tents. It's meant to be both an expression of gratitude for the bounty and a reminder of the time of wandering and sleeping in Bedouin tents. Tomorrow, as Jews begin to celebrate Sukkot, we take the time to recognize and hopefully atone a bit for our government forcing people to wander across the land against their will. The treatment of native tribes in this land is an embarrassment. It's a horror show spread out over 400 years. And arguably one of the worst stories of torment is known as the Trail of Tears. In 1830, Andrew Jackson signed into law the Indian Removal Act, which authorized the president to negotiate with native tribes and Western states to relocate the tribes from fertile, economically valuable land to less valuable lands in the West, lands that were recently acquired through the Louisiana Purchase. And of course, that's a whole horror show in itself, but let's stick to the Trail of Tears right now. There were 5 tribes known by white people at the time as the 5 civilized tribes, which were immediately drawn into negotiation. The Cherokee, the Creek, Chickasaw, Choctaw, and Seminole nations. And they were considered civilized because they were perceived by white people as making the effort to assimilate. Really, they were willing to negotiate with the US government in the name of peace. And all of these tribes, especially the Cherokee, were quick to use the federal court system to try to reverse or at least delay removal. But still, over 4 decades after the passage of the Removal Act, more than 100,000 people were relocated. And there were dozens of legal cases leading up to that. But one of them, Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, made it all the way to the Supreme Court. Justice John Marshall wrote the majority opinion that the state had no jurisdiction to move anyone against their will. And Andrew Jackson was so furious about the decision, he decided to simply ignore it. Sound familiar? And he said, Marshall made his decision, now let him enforce it. And with that, an estimated 15,000 to 20,000 Cherokees were marched to Oklahoma and other states in 1838 to 1839. And Sally Farney described circumstances that weren't exactly in the Trail of Tears, but they were common throughout all of these stories. And on the Trail of Tears, of those 15 to 20,000 people, more than 4,000 died en route. That's almost a quarter of everybody forced to march. But they were only moved after John Ross, chief of the Cherokees, signed a treaty accepting Western land as compensation. And this, of course, caused a huge rift among the people he was charged to protect. And to this day, he's considered a traitor to his people. And there were some heroes among the Cherokee who stayed behind. After the treaties of 1817 and 1890, 11, 13 years before the Removal Act, there were 60 families in North Carolina described by the courts as being sober and industrious, who were allowed to own their land and were willing to own their land. There were also a few who managed to return from Oklahoma and join them so that they became 1,000 strong at that time. And today, the Eastern Band of Cherokee number almost 14,000. And that's still fewer than were present in that region in 1838. Now, you may be wondering why anyone had to be moved. Well, the Indian problem, as it was called then, was twofold. First, there were an awful lot of Christians who really believed that God only smiled on lands where everyone believed. And if anyone wasn't following the word of God, then tragedy would strike the land and everyone would suffer. Now, of course, this kind of belief system wasn't new. Romans persecuted Christians for exactly the same reason. More importantly, though, none of the indigenous nations believed in the private ownership of land. They wouldn't participate in the commodification of their mother, the earth. If they couldn't be bought off, then the government didn't know how to deal fairly with them. So they were a problem. And this wasn't happening just in the South. It was happening in the North too. There were forced migrations from northern states as well, especially in Wisconsin and Illinois. The Wendat, pejoratively called the Huron, were especially hard hit. And of course, throughout history, there have been many other periods of migration across the globe. The most obvious is the capture and enslavement of African Americans, of Africans, to the United States and to other countries. There have been waves of migration to the United States from Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. Waves way too many for me to enumerate here. More than 6 million African Americans moved for jobs from the South to the North just in the first 70 years of the last century. And both of those migrations were voluntary, in theory. But I would bet that most, if not all, of those moving felt like they didn't have any other choice if they wanted to survive social and economic systems that excluded or victimized them. They felt like their choice was to move or die. It's not really much of a choice. And that's the dilemma faced by a lot of Ukrainians since the hostile invasion by Russia began 8 months ago. War is forcing them to move. In Latin America, war hasn't been waged by outside invaders, but in many countries, local warlords are threatening the lives of anyone they see as challengers of their power. So those folks, too, are faced with the decision to flee or die. And when these refugees arrive in the United States, instead of finding opportunity or even the most basic care, the big thing lately is to trick them to get onto buses or airplanes and then ship them to liberal states like Massachusetts and New York. We're even starting to see medical refugees forced to make this terrible decision. Just this week, I've been hearing on the news about families who are facing the choice between moving to other states or staying at home and being criminally investigated for child abuse, simply for allowing their children to receive gender-affirming care, like puberty blockers or other hormones. And it breaks my heart to think about all the people having to cross state lines, even for short periods, and some extended periods, to seek abortions. All of this is a stark reminder that in the land of the free, people have always been moved around the continent as if they were pawns in a giant political chess game. And it continues. Being forced to move around by fiat or by circumstance is part of the human experience, and it's baked into the DNA of our nation. You know, this congregation, like the Jews, has done a bit of moving around too. Now, I want to be clear that it has been nothing in comparison to the kind of forced migration that I've been talking about. There's no comparison. But we do know a tiny bit about what it's like to be without a permanent home and the challenges that come with that. Since its founding, this congregation has gathered in, I think, 3 different places, the most notable of which were the Episcopal Church at URI and the Bingo Hall at the American Legion. You just say Bingo Hall and people chuckle. Now, while having to set up everything from scratch every Sunday was a pain, it was a kind of happy wandering during those years. Seriously, like everybody who talks about it or thinks about it can't help but chuckle or smile. There was joy in that kind of wandering. But the challenge was putting down roots. I mean, how can you thrive when you're struggling just to meet basic needs from week to week? And of course, that's the challenge of wandering. So we've been in a permanent home for a little while now, right? And that also has its challenges. I mean, right, you've had to bring the building up to code and remodel it to meet the needs of the congregation, things like building the Oneto room and leveling this floor off so it wasn't a big slope. And all of that has taken time and money, and the work still isn't done. We still don't have an elevator. And in a way, we're struggling to meet the needs of people we want to include on the spiritual journey. And that's the challenge. That's the happy challenge. That's what's left us without the funds to meet the needs of the people who are really struggling, our neighbors. You know, people seeking abortions in places where it's become legal, refugees seeking safety in deep red southern states, parents trying to raise socially conscious children who are comfortable in their own skin, parents of transgender youth trying to find jobs in places where their children will be safe, and so many more. And that's why I'm so glad that the Carolyn Hurtis Fund exists. When Carolyn Hurtis died more than a year ago, she left an incredible $50,000 to the congregation in the hopes that it would be used not to make improvements to the building or to buy down the mortgage, but for allowing this congregation to be a force for social justice in South County. That's pretty amazing. We don't have to worry about scrounging up the money to fund something like OWL facilitators training or make signs for a rally or to support a neighbor who's doing a really good program. We have that money. And perhaps for the first time, this congregation is able to dream big about what we can do to make a difference in the lives of our neighbors in need. We can provide services, we can train teachers, all of that stuff. The possibilities are absolutely endless. And the thing is, I'm not standing here asking you to give money to the Carolyn Hurtis Fund. I mean, you can if you want to, right? But that's not what I'm doing today. I'm letting you know that this exists. This is an amazing opportunity for us, now that we're not wandering anymore, to help the people who are forced into wandering. Just think about what you want to do, what we can all do together, how we can make a difference, because there is so much work to do. So may we have the fortitude and the gratitude and the generosity to stand in solidarity with all those who wander, willingly or forcibly. So please, rise now as you are willing and able, and join me in opening the gray hymnal to number 121, We'll Build a Land. Now, I always sing people together instead of brothers and sisters, just because that feels more welcoming and inclusive to me. You might want to do this now.